So, last video before Spooky Day falls upon us, and I am in the swing of it, playing plenty of horror games, watching Doctor Who again and such, when the Siege Netflix Sparkless Seeker turns up at my door, and wins my community poll for the next video by a landslide, so I suppose we gotta take a look at him. So, for some context, the Siege show, where this guy was from, had an interestingly mediocre run of reused assets that were put into the Netflix subline that mostly dirtied up the pre-existing mainline molds to use for other purposes, and in this case, the Starscream, or I suppose Thundercracker because of the solid chest flap and twat grin, was used to represent a bunch of undead zombies for a solid 2 minutes that I vaguely remember from the Netflix show. So being a Siege figure and all, the details of this figure are sublime. I do not have many figures with this level of intricate mechanical technobabble strewn across every surface. The proportions are very leggy and limber, which reminds me an awful lot of Prime Starscream, which is amplified even greater by the stiletto hooves for feet. The back of the figure is really well detailed too. There are no discernible gaps to speak of. The Seeker stacks protrude high and proudly just behind the head as to not impede the head movement at all. And the Astro Trainee triple thruster backpack gives a nice center point, although it does stick out a little bit far for my liking. Unfortunately, there is a rather large butt flap that looks a bit on the uglier side, and impedes posing the waist and the legs, which isn't a massive issue, but it is enough to warrant pointing out. Painting on this guy is interesting to say the least. While the colour of green chosen is a nice shade for seeing the sculpted details, it's very bland in its just general unbrokenness. A couple of moments of deep black break up the figure, mostly in the joints. Aside from that though, the only accenting colours are occasional gradients of dull brown, which feels a little bit too haphazard, unless you maybe think of it as rust. I do quite like the matte grey on the face though. The colour choices here do feel appropriately lifeless, but it doesn't give me the vibe of a walking corpse as much as it does just a regular Seeker who didn't luck out on any of the colour wheel aspects. Maybe a different face sculpt or some battle damage would help, but for now the deco isn't most to my liking. As for accessories, there are a couple of null rays like any Seeker. These ones are very snipery and remind me a lot of the Nucleon charge rifles from Fall of Cybertron. Aside from that, they aren't the most interesting. They're very flat, the pegs are a bit loose so they tend to sway off in whatever direction when you try and touch them, but at least they do fill out the look nicely. He does come with a pair of Battle Masters that are surprisingly fun. This is my first real experience with Siege Battle Masters, and I can't really say that I've ever liked Target Masters more. The guns are a lot more fun and interesting than other ones I've handled, and the robot modes actually have a decent little bit of posing. They also include some fantastic blast effects. I love the purple one, it's very dynamic. Now the transformation on this guy doesn't have a lot going for it. It's a full-blown shell former for starters, with the only part with uses in both modes being the shoulder pylons becoming a nose cone, in an interesting but slightly fiddly and tedious process, and the chest plate plugging into the back of the alt mode takes a bit more grunt than I like applying. The alt mode is a very long and gradual Tetrajet that I don't know if I'm into. The details are all there, the wingspan is good and it feels really nice and weighty in hand, but I feel like I would have liked it more if it was a bit taller and a bit narrower towards the front, and just a touch more dynamic a shape. While the proportions feeling off is down to personal preference, I am very much not a fan of the entire robot mode squelched up underneath. It's just a big block that's visible from every angle. It feels underwhelming and lazy, and I can't comprehend this thing being a terrifying Decepticon fighter jet even when I get it into the air. Overall, I'm not sure I would recommend the Sparkless Seeker. It was worth the discounted price I paid, but I wouldn't go looking for it. However, if you come across one of the other, more interestingly coloured Siege Seekers, that I would recommend. While I wouldn't call it my favourite Seeker mould, it is a great mould in robot mode, with amazing posability, striking sculpt with some fun accessories, and a bit of a nothing alt mode. So in robot mode it shall stay, lumbering about my shelves, looking for fresh brains to eat, or just stand at the back of a growing Seeker squad. Who knows?